It was November 1875. London was wrapped in a fog thick enough to taste. In Mayfair's dining rooms, the world's most powerful men ate in comfort, speaking of coal prices and the Indian monsoon. None of them knew that 3 miles east, disaster was quietly taking shape. Inside 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli stood motionless. Before him lay a telegram from Cairo. 12 words that could sink Britain's empire, or secure it for a century. The message was clear. Egypt's Khedive was drowning in debt. He would sell his shares in the Suez Canal. £4 million, immediate payment, required. First buyer, wins. The stakes. Only the most strategically vital waterway humanity had ever carved, through rock and sand. The jugular vein, connecting Britain to its richest colony, India. Why did a canal in Egypt's sand terrify a British Prime Minister? Because in 1875, geography was power. Steam engines had shrunk the world, but could not eliminate it. Before 1869, reaching India meant circumnavigating Africa. 13,000 miles of treacherous seas. 6 months, if the weather smiled. Forever, if storms or pirates found you first. Then a Frenchman, Ferdinand de Lesseps, proposed the insane: to slice through 100 miles of desert, connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. British engineers called it hydraulically impossible. British politicians called it a French plot to strangle British commerce. They were half right about the second part. When the canal opened in 1869, it slashed the journey to India from 6 months to 6 weeks. Trade exploded. Fortunes were made overnight. And France controlled the route. Because they'd built it, financed it, owned it. For Britain, this was a strategic catastrophe. India generated 20% of British government revenue. Its cotton, tea, and opium trade enriched thousands of British merchants. The canal was no longer just convenient. It was essential, and it belonged to France. Every British vessel paid French toll fees. Every British strategy depended on French goodwill. If France closed the canal during a crisis, say a war, the British Empire would suffocate economically. The man about to sell his nation's future was Ismail Pasha, Egypt's Khedive since 1863, a man of dazzling vision and catastrophic judgment. He looked at Cairo's medieval streets and felt only shame. His dream? To transform Egypt into a European power. He famously declared, "My country is no longer in Africa. We are part of Europe now." To prove it, he spent money Egypt didn't have on a facade of European modernity. He built an opera house modeled after La Scala, constructed palaces copying Versailles, laid thousands of miles just of telegraph lines and railways, hired Italian architects, French engineers, German bankers, all on borrowed money. For the canal's opening in 1869, he staged history's most expensive party. He paved a road with silver from the pyramids to his palace, just so European royalty's carriages wouldn't gather dust. 600 guests. Consumed 12,000 bottles of champagne. He commissioned Verdi's opera, Aida, specifically for the occasion. A story celebrating ancient Egyptian grandeur, ironically staged to mask modern Egyptian dependency. The budget for one evening exceeded what most Egyptian families earned in a lifetime. Beneath the silken gold, financial cancer metastasized. Ismail borrowed his first European loan in 1862 at 7% interest. By 1875, he'd taken 16 more. The last at 26%. European bankers knew he was doomed. They just wanted to extract maximum profit. Before 1875 collapse, the economics seemed simple at first. During America's Civil War, Southern cotton vanished from world markets. Egyptian cotton prices quintupled. Money flooded Cairo. Ismail assumed prosperity was permanent. Fatal mistake. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox in 1865, Southern cotton returned. Egyptian prices crashed 80% overnight. Ismail's income evaporated. His debts didn't. They compounded. By 1875, he owed £90 million on an economy generating $10 million annually. The arithmetic of doom. Annual Egyptian revenue, £10 million. Annual interest payments, $9 million. That left $1 million. To operate a government, maintain an army, educate children, and feed 7 million people. This wasn't mismanagement. It was financial strangulation. In spreadsheet form, by November 1875, soldiers hadn't been paid in months. Teachers worked without salaries. Infrastructure decayed. Ismail had one asset remaining: his 44% stake in the Suez Canal Company, 176,602 shares, the family jewels. He would rather have died than sell them. But bankruptcy doesn't care about preference. Ismail quietly approached the French government. Paris was euphoric. For £4 million, they'd control 94% of the canal. The Mediterranean would become a French lake. They began drafting contracts, certain of success. But empires leak information, like ships leak water. At a Mayfair dinner party, a French banker's wife couldn't resist boasting. One man listened with unusual intensity. Frederick Greenwood, editor of the Pall Mall Gazette. Greenwood understood immediately. He abandoned dinner before dessert, hired a cab, and raced through fog-choked streets to the Foreign Office. He found Lord Derby, the Foreign Secretary, at his club and delivered the bombshell. Derby was skeptical. Diplomatic rumors flew constantly, but he sent urgent cables to Cairo anyway. The British consul confirmed it. The Khedive was negotiating with France. Sale could conclude within days. Derby immediately informed Prime Minister Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli grasped the opportunity's magnitude instantly. Age 70, exhausted by political warfare, suffering gout. But this was the prize he'd dreamed of: securing India's route forever, transforming a French asset into British control. But vision meant nothing without means. The Khedive demanded £4 million immediately. In 1875, currency equivalent to £500 million today. A sum large enough to build 50 warships or fund Britain's army for 18 months. Disraeli checked the calendar with sinking dread. Parliament, in exception for 7 weeks. British constitutional law, crystal clear. Not one penny of government funds could be spent without parliamentary authorization. The Prime Minister was legally powerless. Meanwhile, France faced no such constraints. Their more autocratic government could move immediately. French bankers were already preparing the gold transfer. They expected signatures within 72 hours. Disraeli was trapped between constitutional law and strategic necessity. As midnight approached, Disraeli sat alone. His rival William Gladstone would have called this a moment for Christian restraint, fiscal responsibility, parliamentary process. Disraeli called it an opportunity to bet everything on a single hand of cards. He summoned Montague Corey, his private secretary. Young, loyal, worshipful. Corey would do anything for the old man. Disraeli posed a question that sounded like dark comedy. Where can we find £4 million by Tuesday without telling anyone? They systematically eliminated options. Bank of England? Its Governor Thomas Hankey was famously cautious. He'd written a book arguing banks should never take risks. He'd demand parliamentary approval, formal collateral, legal documentation. Impossible in 48 hours. British merchant banks? Too small for a transaction this massive. Foreign banks? Would leak information immediately. Half of European diplomacy involved buying gossip from bankers' secretaries. Disraeli needed someone with 3 impossible qualities combined. First, extraordinary liquidity, ability to move millions in gold within hours. Second, absolute discretion, trusted by both governments and markets. Third, geopolitical vision, someone who understood this wasn't just finance, but history. Only one name fit: Rothschild. The House of Rothschild was Europe's true superpower. They'd financed Wellington's victory at Waterloo, built half of Europe's railways, literally saved the Bank of England during the 1825 financial crisis. Governments rose and fell. Rothschild endured. London's patriarch was Lionel de Rothschild. Baron de Rothschild since his Austrian title, the first professing Jew permitted to sit in parliament, after being elected and denied 11 consecutive times over a decade. His relationship with Disraeli ran deep. Disraeli and Rothschild shared more than friendship. They shared the bond of outsiders who'd smashed through society's walls. Disraeli, baptized Christian but forever labeled the Jew by enemies. Rothschild, elected 11 times before being allowed his seat. They recognized each other's wounds. Disraeli gave Corey verbal orders, critically, nothing written. Go to New Court immediately. Find Baron Rothschild. Tell him I need £4 million by tomorrow morning. And Montague, this conversation never happened. Corey asked the question that could destroy everything. Sir, what shall I offer as security? Security means collateral, the assets pledged if a loan defaults. Traditionally, gold reserves, government bonds, perhaps colonial territories. Disraeli had none of these. He didn't even have legal authority to borrow. Disraeli looked at the fire, then at Corey. He spoke 5 words that would echo through financial history. The security is the government, not British gold, not territories, not legal authority. Just a promise backed solely by Britain's reputation for honoring debts. It was the most magnificent bluff in financial history. If Parliament rejected the deal, Disraeli faced impeachment, disgrace, possible imprisonment for misappropriation. Rothschild would lose £4 million. The scandal would detonate both their careers. Everything hung on trust. Montague Corey walked into the November fog carrying a verbal message worth £4 million and a handshake worth an empire. He was 31 years old. The fate of the Middle East rode with him in a hansom cab through London's wet streets. Simultaneously in Cairo, Khedive Ismail paced, while French diplomats applied relentless pressure. Sign now, they insisted. The British Parliament won't reconvene for weeks. They're too slow, too democratic, too constrained by their precious laws. Ismail stalled them with excuses. He needed to consult advisors, review documents, pray for guidance. Truth was, he preferred British control to French. Britain already dominated Egypt's economy. French control of the canal plus Egyptian debt would make Egypt a French colony in all but name. Corey's carriage clattered through the city of London, that square mile where more wealth changed hands daily than most nations possessed entirely. He arrived at St. Swithin's Lane, New Court, the marble temple where Rothschild wrote history with fountain pens and ledgers. New Court wasn't a bank as ordinary people understood banks. No tellers, no queues, no posted hours. It was a private fortress where deals involving kingdoms were negotiated in whispers. Only those who already possessed power even knew where to knock. Corey was shown to a private office. The legend of what happened next has been told in British clubs for 150 years. Baron Lionel de Rothschild was eating muscatel grapes, slowly, deliberately, spitting seeds onto Sèvres porcelain with aristocratic precision. When Corey entered, breathless, urgent, Rothschild didn't look up. He continued his grape selection with the concentration of a man tasting wine, not receiving a message worth millions. It was psychological dominance performed as dinner theater. Corey forced steadiness into his voice. Baron, the Prime Minister requires £4 million by tomorrow morning to purchase the Khedive Suez Canal shares. The matter is extraordinarily sensitive. Speed is essential. The French are hours from closing their own deal. Rothschild finally looked up. Those eyes, legendary in the city for reading the truth of any proposition in seconds, locked onto Corey's. He asked one question. The only question that mattered. What is Mr. Disraeli's security? Corey delivered the line exactly as instructed, forcing confidence into each word. The security, Baron, is the British government. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds. It felt like 5 years. Rothschild took another grape, chewed, swallowed. Rothschild was calculating risks invisible to ordinary bankers. Financial risk? Could Parliament be persuaded? Political risk? Would Disraeli survive? Personal risk if the deal collapsed. Could even a Rothschild survive lending $4 million on a handshake? But also opportunity to reshape the Middle East. But beneath all calculation lay something deeper. Character assessment. Rothschild had known Disraeli for 25 years. Watched him climb from mocked outsider to prime minister. Disraeli's word wasn't backed by gold. It was backed by something rarer. A man who'd rather die than break it. Baron Rothschild set down the grape. He looked at Corey, and he spoke 4 words that would change 3 continents. You shall have it. Just like that. No lawyers, no contracts, no board meetings. a verbal commitment worth £4 million. Within minutes, Rothschild was mobilizing his network. Coded telegrams flashed to Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt. Assemble gold and credit immediately. Utmost discretion. The Rothschild machine, built over 5 generations, roared into action. Gold began moving across Europe. Rothschild's terms were steep but reasonable, 2.5% commission plus 5% annual interest. On a loan this massive and risky, actually quite generous, he'd profit perhaps $100,000. Significant, but not predatory. This was geopolitical investment, not usury. Corey raced back to Downing Street as dawn broke over London. He burst into Disraeli's study where the old man had waited all night, exhaustion and anxiety carved into his face. When Corey delivered the news, Disraeli's transformation was instant. Years fell away. Disraeli immediately wrote to Queen Victoria. He knew she loved decisiveness and despised parliamentary dithering. His letter was a masterpiece of triumphant brevity designed to make her feel she'd personally conquered Egypt. "It is settled, madam. You have it. The French government has been outmaneuvered. The Khedive's shares, and with them the key to India, are yours. Your Indian empire is secured for a generation." Victoria's diary that night. "It is indeed immense." By noon, Rothschild's gold arrived in Cairo. British Consul General Stephen Cave personally delivered it to the Khedive's treasurer. Ismail's relief was visible. He'd been literally hours from bankruptcy declaration. The French diplomats watching felt history turn against them. The French agents' cables to Paris were furious. They'd negotiated for weeks, had contracts drafted, were hours from signatures, and the British had stolen victory with an unconstitutional loan arranged in one foggy night. French diplomatic failure was complete. The share certificates, 176,002 shares of the Universal Company of the Suez Maritime Canal, were packed in iron-bound wooden chests, sealed with British government wax. They sailed to England aboard HMS Himalaya under armed Royal Navy Guard. When news broke in London, the reaction was volcanic. The Times, "A masterstroke of imperial policy." Even Disraeli's enemies, and he had legions, had to admire the sheer audacity. British public went wild. This was the bold imperial adventure they'd been raised to worship. But here, triumph becomes tragedy. The £4 million that seemed so massive in London was meaningless in Cairo. Ismail's total debts exceeded £90 million. The British money evaporated in weeks, consumed entirely by interest payments on other loans. Nothing actually improved. By April 1876, just 5 months later, Ismail announced bankruptcy again. Suspended all debt payments. European bondholders panicked. London Stock Exchange trembled. But now everything had changed fundamentally. Britain wasn't an observer anymore. Britain was an owner. Before November 1875, Egyptian bankruptcy was unfortunate but distant. After November 1875, it directly threatened British strategic assets worth far more than £4 million. The logic of imperialism began its inexorable, predictable work. In 1878, Britain and France imposed dual control, the polite term for foreign occupation disguised as financial management. British Controller General supervised Egyptian revenues. French Controller General supervised expenditures. Egyptian sovereignty became theater for foreign audiences. The controllers slashed spending like surgeons removing gangrene, except the patient was a living society. Government workforce cut 40%. Army reduced from 90,000 to 30,000 men. Taxes on peasants doubled while revenue flowed to European banks. Austerity as weapon. Egyptian rage built like steam in a sealed engine. Their taxes funded European bankers' profits while their children ate bread and onions once daily. Army officers, unpaid for months, became receptive to a colonel named Ahmed Urabi who promised Egypt for Egyptians. Urabi's demands were revolutionary. Expel foreign financial controllers, end dual control, establish Egyptian parliament with real power, make Egypt's government answer to Egyptians rather than European bondholders. His movement grew with terrifying speed. By 1882, he effectively controlled Cairo. London's response revealed imperial priorities with brutal clarity. They didn't care about Egyptian self-determination or democracy. They cared about one thing: ensuring nothing disrupted Suez Canal traffic or threatened debt repayment. Urabi threatened both. He had to be destroyed. In June 1882, riots erupted in Alexandria after a trivial dispute escalated. Europeans were killed. The British government, now led by Gladstone, Disraeli's old enemy who deposed imperial expansion, found pretexts compelling when strategic assets were threatened. The Royal Navy sailed to Alexandria with Britain's most modern ironclad warships. Ultimatum delivered: dismantle your coastal fortifications within 24 hours. Urabi, understanding surrender meant permanent foreign control, refused. July 11, 1882, British shells began falling. For 10 hours, British naval guns, the most advanced in the world, pulverized Alexandria. Fortifications designed for an earlier era of warfare simply disintegrated. Fires spread through residential neighborhoods. When silence finally fell, a major Arab city lay in smoking ruins. British troops, 25,000 strong, landed and marched toward Cairo. Urabi gathered Egypt's army, poorly equipped, underpaid for 2 years, but fighting for something beyond paychecks, the idea that Egypt should belong to Egyptians. They made their stand at Tel el-Kebir, September 13, 1882, dawn. The Battle of Tel el-Kebir lasted 35 minutes. British cavalry, artillery, and infantry, trained to machine precision, crushed Egyptian resistance. It wasn't combat. It was industrial warfare applied to anti-colonial resistance. Over 2,000 Egyptians died, British losses 57. British cavalry rode into Cairo triumphantly. General Garnet Wolseley announced, with what historians would later recognize as calculated deception, that occupation was temporary. We'll restore order and leave immediately. They were already planning permanent bases. The temporary occupation lasted 72 years. British troops wouldn't fully withdraw until 1954, after 2 world wars, Egyptian independence struggles, and generations of resistance. A £4 million loan in 1875 had become military conquest by 1882, colonial administration by 1900. This is the Suez Purchase's true legacy. It fundamentally changed British imperialism's nature. Before 1875, Britain preferred informal empire, trade without governance, profit without administration. After 1875, debt created chains that dragged them into territorial conquest. The progression was inexorable. Buy the shares to secure the route, protect the shares by controlling Egyptian finances, control finances by imposing foreign administrators, protect administrators by military occupation, protect occupation by annexing Sudan, controlling Egypt's water supply at the Nile's source. The supreme irony. Disraeli died in 1881, months before the invasion he'd inadvertently triggered. He thought he'd pulled off a clever financial deal securing India's route. He never imagined he'd started a chain reaction that would define Middle Eastern politics for 140 years and counting. And what of the Rothschilds? They profited, handsomely, collecting their commission and interest, when Parliament ratified the transaction months later. The $4 million was repaid in full. Their reputation as bankers to empires was cemented for another generation. But Lionel de Rothschild gained something more valuable than money: proof that his word could move mountains. When he'd said, "You shall have it," over muscatel grapes, he'd committed his family's 5-generation reputation. He'd delivered. In the world of international finance, that was worth more than gold. The British government profited too, on paper. Those 176,602 shares generated dividends annually. They also gave Britain leverage over every Suez Canal company decision. But the real profit wasn't financial. It was strategic positioning that would shape 2 world wars. For Egypt, the sale marked the beginning of national suffocation. The Khedive's $4 million evaporated within months, consumed entirely by interest payments to other European creditors. The underlying catastrophe remained untouched. Egypt was a patient given aspirin for terminal cancer. The dual control imposed in 1878 was colonialism without honesty. British and French controllers didn't fly their nation's flags over Egyptian buildings. That would be too obvious. Instead, they installed themselves in administrative offices where they controlled every pound collected and spent. They imposed savage austerity. Government wages slashed 40%. Public works abandoned mid-construction. Education funding gutted. Meanwhile, tax collectors, backed by British military threat, extracted every possible pister from peasants who could barely feed their children. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Annual Egyptian revenue, $10 million. Annual debt service to European banks, $9 million. That left $1 million to operate an entire country, to feed 7 million people, to maintain an army, to educate children. It was economic strangulation disguised as fiscal responsibility. Into this cauldron stepped Colonel Ahmed Urabi, son of a village sheikh risen through military ranks by merit rather than aristocratic birth. He looked at Egypt's humiliation and saw opportunity for revolution. His message was electric in its simplicity. Egypt for the Egyptians. Urabi's platform was revolutionary. Expel foreign financial controllers, establish a representative parliament, make Egypt's government answer to Egyptians rather than European bondholders. By 1882, his movement controlled Cairo. The Khedive was a figurehead. Real power belonged to Egypt's first nationalist movement. London's establishment watched with mounting horror. They didn't care about Egyptian democracy or self-determination. Those concepts applied only to white Europeans. They cared about one thing, the Suez Canal. And Urabi's movement threatened canal security, debt repayment, and British strategic control. The British press launched a propaganda campaign portraying Urabi as a dangerous fanatic. They ignored that his demands, parliamentary government, financial transparency, national sovereignty, were identical to principles Britain claimed to champion. Hypocrisy so brazen it would be comedic if the consequences weren't so tragic. June 1882. Alexandria riots erupt after a trivial street dispute escalates. Europeans are killed. The violence is genuine but localized. British newspapers report it as wholesale massacre. Even William Gladstone, supposedly the moral conscience of British politics, finds the pretext he needs. Gladstone, who'd spent years condemning Disraeli's imperialism, now discovered that strategic assets made moralists into pragmatists. He authorized military action with barely concealed enthusiasm. Principles were negotiable, the canal was not. July 11, 1882. The Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet appeared off Alexandria. Admiral Seymour delivered ultimatum: dismantle coastal fortifications within 24 hours or face bombardment. Urabi, understanding surrender meant permanent subjugation, refused. At dawn, British guns spoke. For 10 hours, the most advanced naval artillery in the world pounded Alexandria. Fortifications built for an earlier era of warfare simply vaporized. Fires spread into residential neighborhoods. When silence finally fell over the smoke, a major Arab city lay in ruins. European quarters, strangely, were largely untouched. British Expeditionary Force, 25,000 men under General Garnet Wolseley, landed and marched toward Cairo. Egyptian nationalist army gathered at Tel el-Kebir to make their stand. Poorly equipped, unpaid for 2 years, but fighting for the revolutionary idea that Egypt should belong to Egyptians. September 13, 1882, 4:30 a.m. British forces attacked under cover of darkness. The battle lasted 35 minutes. It wasn't combat, it was industrial slaughter. Breech-loading rifles, artillery, cavalry in perfect coordination. Egyptian formations disintegrated. Over 2,000 Egyptians dead. British casualties, 57. British cavalry rode triumphantly into Cairo. Urabi was arrested, tried, and exiled. His dream of Egyptian self-government died on the scaffold of British strategic interest. General Wolseley announced with calculated mendacity that occupation was temporary. British forces were already surveying locations for permanent barracks. The British constructed what historians call the Veiled Protectorate. Egypt remained theoretically independent. The Khedive still ruled, Egyptian courts still functioned, but real power belonged to the British Consul General, who governed from shadows. Colonial rule without colonial responsibility. Most influential was Evelyn Baring, later Lord Cromer, British Consul General for 24 years. He ruled Egypt with absolute authority while maintaining the fiction that Egyptians ruled themselves. His contempt for Egyptians was legendary. He believed they were racially incapable of self-government. Under British administration, Egyptian cotton and grain continued flowing to European markets. Tax revenue continued servicing European debts. The Suez Canal, now firmly under British control, generated enormous wealth. None of it stayed in Egypt. The country was a colonial cash machine disguised as a sovereign state. When World War I erupted in 1914, Disraeli's gamble showed its true strategic value. The canal became the lifeline of the Allied war effort. Indian troops, Australian forces, supplies from Asia all flowed through Suez. If Germany or Ottoman Turkey had controlled it, the war's outcome might have been reversed. Britain formally declared Egypt a protectorate in 1914, finally admitting what had been true since 1882. They sent 500,000 troops to defend the canal from Ottoman attacks. Egyptian wishes were irrelevant. Egypt's strategic location made Egyptian consent unnecessary. The canal's wartime importance triggered new betrayals. Britain promised Arab leaders independence if they rebelled against Ottoman rule, the famous Lawrence of Arabia campaigns. Simultaneously, Sykes-Picot agreements secretly divided the Middle East between Britain and France. The canal had to be protected by controlling everything around it. After World War I, Egyptian nationalism exploded. Revolution in 1919 paralyzed the country. Britain, exhausted by war, bankrupt, facing independence movements across the empire, made concessions. In 1922, they declared Egypt independent, but with 4 massive exceptions. The 4 reserved points. British troops would remain to protect the Suez Canal. Britain would control Egypt's defense and foreign policy. Britain would protect foreign interests and minorities in Egypt. Britain would control Sudan. This independence was sovereignty with all meaningful powers removed. British troops never left the canal zone. By the 1930s, over 100,000 British and Imperial soldiers garrisoned the canal. They built entire cities, Port Said, Ismailia, as British colonial settlements. Egyptian sovereignty stopped at the canal's edge. Britain had created a state within a state. World War II proved the canal's strategic value again. Rommel's Africa Corps pushed toward Egypt with one goal: seize the canal, cut Britain's imperial jugular. The Battle of El Alamein in 1942 wasn't just military victory. It was existential defense of the asset Disraeli had secured 67 years earlier. During the war, Egypt remained theoretically neutral but practically occupied. British forces controlled the country absolutely. When King Farouk showed insufficient enthusiasm for Allied cause, British tanks surrounded his palace. The ambassador informed him he would abdicate or die. Egyptian sovereignty was theater maintained by British bayonets. After World War II, Britain was exhausted, bankrupt, losing colonies globally. Indian independence in 1947 removed the original justification for controlling Egypt. The route to India no longer existed. But by then, the canal had become valuable for oil from the Persian Gulf. New justifications replaced old ones. Egyptian resentment finally exploded in 1952. Young military officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the monarchy. Nasser's vision was Urabi's dream reborn: genuine Egyptian independence, pan-Arab nationalism, defiance of Western control. In 1954, Britain finally agreed to withdraw troops, 72 years after the temporary occupation began. But Nasser wasn't satisfied with British military withdrawal. He wanted something more profound: Egyptian ownership of the canal itself. On July 26, 1956, he announced nationalization of the Suez Canal Company. The shares Disraeli had purchased 81 years earlier, and the French shares too, would belong to Egypt. The Egyptian flag would finally fly over Egyptian territory. Britain's reaction was visceral rage. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, personally humiliated by Nasser's defiance, compared him to Hitler. Britain secretly conspired with France and Israel to invade Egypt, overthrow Nasser, and retake the canal. It was imperialism's death spasm, one final attempt to reverse decolonization. October 1956, Israel invaded Sinai. Britain and France, pretending surprise, demanded both sides withdraw from the canal. When Egypt refused, British and French paratroopers seized the canal zone. It was a transparent charade. The world wasn't fooled. Neither was the United States. President Eisenhower was furious. America opposed European colonialism, partly from principle, mostly from self-interest. The Cold War demanded Third World support, and invading Egypt played into Soviet hands. Eisenhower delivered ultimatum: withdraw immediately or face American economic sanctions that would collapse the British pound. Britain had no choice. Within weeks, they withdrew in humiliation. Eden resigned in disgrace. The Suez Crisis became the official moment Britain ceased being a superpower. The asset that Disraeli thought would secure the empire forever became the stage for the empire's public execution. Nasser's nationalization succeeded. Egypt owned the canal. Egyptian engineers operated it efficiently, disproving racist claims that only Europeans could manage complex infrastructure. The canal generated revenue for Egypt instead of European shareholders. It was genuine independence at last, 81 years after Disraeli's purchase. But the legacy of 1875 extends far beyond canal ownership. Disraeli's purchase created the template for British imperialism in the Middle East. It established the principle that Western strategic interests trumped Arab self-determination. That principle didn't die in 1956. It morphed, it adapted, it continues. The borders drawn in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, created to protect the canal, still define the Middle East. Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, all artificial states created by British and French pencils on maps. The ethnic and sectarian conflicts those borders created still generate wars and refugees today. Palestine's tragedy traces directly to British control of Egypt. Balfour Declaration in 1917, promising Jews a homeland in Palestine, was motivated partly by protecting the canal route. Britain needed a loyal sentinel at the gates of the East. This strategic paranoia turned the Middle East into a chessboard where local lives were mere pawns for canal security. This legacy of interventionism remains the region's defining scar. Even the current geometry of global energy relies on this 19th century arrangement. The canal remains the jugular vein of the world economy, a reality Khedive Ismail sensed but couldn't master. He built a bridge to the future, but his people paid the toll in blood. Today, the Suez Canal earns Egypt billions in transit fees. But the 72-year occupation it triggered shaped the modern Egyptian psyche. A deep-seated suspicion of foreign intervention and a fierce pride in national sovereignty that Nasser personified. The debt that swallowed Ismail's Egypt was more than financial, it was a loss of agency. When a nation's strategic assets are owned by foreign banks, its domestic laws become suggestions, and its leaders become employees of global capital. Disraeli's gamble proved that in the game of empires, speed and credit are as lethal as gunpowder. By bypassing Parliament, he created a precedent for executive power that continues to define how modern states respond to sudden global crises. Lionel de Rothschild's role showed that the true power of the Victorian era wasn't just at Westminster, but in the City of London. Private wealth could mobilize faster than democratic governments, a dynamic we still see in today's global financial markets. The ghost of the 1875 purchase haunted the 20th century. Every time a ship passes through the canal today, it navigates the remnants of a deal made over muscatel grapes and a handshake in a foggy London evening. The 1882 invasion was the first modern resource war. It set the template for later interventions in the Middle East, securing oil, securing routes, and securing stability, often at the expense of local democracy and self-determination. Nasser's victory in 1956 wasn't just about a canal. It was the final rejection of the 1875 logic. It signaled that the era of gentlemanly capitalism and colonial debt traps was ending, at least in its most overt form. Yet the tools developed during the Egyptian debt crisis, the foreign controllers, the imposed austerity, the prioritization of creditors over citizens, are still the standard operating procedures for international finance today. For Britain, the Suez Purchase was the zenith of imperial confidence. For Egypt, it was a long night of subjugation. Between these two truths lies the complex reality of how the modern Middle East was forged in the fire of high finance. As we look at the canal today, we see more than a waterway. We see the backbone of global trade. $10 billion worth of goods pass through here every day. It remains the most vital shortcut on the planet, just as Lesseps envisioned. But the cost of that shortcut was a century of political turmoil. The canal didn't just connect the East and West. It drew them into a permanent, often violent embrace that neither side has been able to break. Ismail's tragedy was his belief that he could buy modernity without paying the price of sovereignty. He thought a canal would make Egypt a European power. Instead, it made Egypt a European prize. Disraeli's triumph was his understanding that history belongs to those who act while others deliberate. He turned a bankrupt Khedive's desperation into a cornerstone of the British Empire, changing the map of the world in 72 hours. The 176,602 shares now sit as a footnote in history books, but their impact is etched into the geography of Egypt, the politics of the Levant, and the vaults of the world's central banks. The 1882 bombardment of Alexandria was the ultimate consequence of a bad loan. It proved that when the interests of bondholders are threatened, the language of diplomacy is quickly replaced by the roar of naval artillery. The veiled protectorate of Lord Cromer was a masterclass in administrative shadow play. It allowed Britain to reap the rewards of empire without the inconvenient responsibilities of formal annexation. The Egyptian peasants, the fellahin, were the silent victims of this grand strategy. Their labor built the canal, and their taxes paid the interest on the debt that eventually led to their country's occupation. World War I cemented the canal's status as the imperial jugular. The battles fought in the Sinai sands were echoes of Disraeli's midnight decision 40 years earlier. Without Suez, the British war effort might have collapsed. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was the ultimate extension of canal security. To protect the waterway, the British and French felt they had to control every mile of desert from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. The 1919 revolution in Egypt was the first great awakening of Arab nationalism against this arrangement. It was a cry for dignity from a people tired of being treated as a strategic asset for a distant queen. Even the independence granted in 1922 was a mirage. As long as British troops stayed in the canal zone, Egyptian sovereignty was a house built on sand. The canal remained a foreign island in the heart of Egypt. The 1952 revolution was the final breaking point. Nasser and the free officers didn't just want the British out. They wanted to reclaim the pride that had been sold along with those shares in 1875. The Suez Crisis of 1956 was the moment the world's power shifted. It was the end of the Victorian era and the beginning of the Cold War. The Americans and Soviets now dictated the terms, and the old empires had to learn their place. Today, the canal is wider and deeper than ever. The new Suez Canal, opened in 2015, shows Egypt's continued commitment to this vital artery, but it is now an Egyptian project, for Egyptian benefit. The 2021 blockage by the Ever Given showed how fragile our global supply chains still are. 6 days of delay caused a ripple effect that touched every market on Earth. We are still, in many ways, captives of this narrow strip of water. The legacy of Disraeli and Rothschild is not just in MP3s or history books, it's in the very nature of how power is exercised through debt, how strategy is disguised as finance, and how the past never truly stays in the past. The story of the Suez Canal is the story of the modern world. It's a tale of ambition, greed, bravery, and the relentless pursuit of a faster way to the other side of the horizon. As we look back at that foggy November night in 1875, we see the moment the 20th century was born. It was born in a private bank with a promise and a pile of muscatel grapes. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. Today's debt-trap diplomacy and strategic infrastructure projects carry the DNA of the Suez Purchase. The players change, but the game remains remarkably similar. The lesson for the future is clear. Strategic independence is the only true sovereignty. Once you sell the keys to your house to pay the interest on your debt, the house is no longer yours. The Suez Canal remains a marvel of engineering and a monument to human persistence. It stands as a reminder of what we can achieve when we bridge the continents, and what we lose when we forget the human cost. For Egypt, the canal is now a source of pride and prosperity. The long road from Ismail's bankruptcy to today's national ownership was paved with the sacrifices of generations. It is finally their canal. And for the rest of us, it is a reminder that the world we live in was shaped by the bold decisions of a few individuals who saw the future and dared to grab it, no matter the consequences. In the end, Disraeli's £4 million didn't just buy shares in a canal, it bought a century of history. It proves that a single evening, a plate of grapes, and a handshake can indeed change the world forever.